Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, whichever time of the day you're going to be viewing this presentation or this e-presentation. This evening, this night, and this afternoon, I'm going to be going through the just 4 slides discussing achieving the effect, language uses in poetry. So I'll be going through imagery, how to integrate imagery into the essay, denotative and connotative language, and then I'll end with 2 figure of speech, allusion and symbol. So I'll start off with the first slide, imagery. The definition reads, imagery is used in literature in order to describe or enhance sensory experiences to the text. So in essence, imagery is really a use of the senses, so you're capturing the different senses. And if you go to the second line, it also tells you how imagery is classified. So it's classified into 6 parts. Again, this are 5 senses, except it includes additional sense, if you can call it that, which would be the kinesthetic movement. The other 5 would be the regular senses that we are accustomed to hearing about: visual, auditory, olfactory. The olfactory would be dealing with the smelling, the sense of smelling, and the gustatory would be looking at or dealing with tasting. And then you have the tactile, which is connected with the sense of touch or sensation. And as I said earlier, the sense that is not generally described within our 5 senses would be the kinesthetic, which is movement. So these are the classification of imagery. So an instance of visual imagery, for example, might evoke a visual cue, such as the crimson blood flowed slowly down his charred face, or an auditory imagery uses language that appeals to hearing. So an example would be one such as bells chiming and roosters crowing. And auditory senses, or auditory imagery tends to use alliterations and onomatopoeia, these 2 figurative speech, which sometimes, or not sometimes, most often emphasize sound. And then you have another example I can give you is the olfactory imagery, which again involves smelling. So for example, it might read somewhere along the line, if I were to give a poetic line saying, his sweaty socks smelled of rotting fish and musty cellars. So the word rotting fish, smelled sweaty socks, musty cellars, somehow conjure very vividly, or allowing the reader to smell. So in essence, imagery really captures a visual picture, very descriptive image in one's mind, just like a descriptive writing would. The next slide will look at integrated imagery into essay, and how do we integrate imagery into essay. So we have 6 points to go through to discuss how this is done. So the first one, which is exactly taken from your sheet, is connecting imagery to the thesis statement. So in this first stage, you're going to be asking yourself, how does a poet uses imagery to strengthen his or her idea? The next one would be connected imagery to the mood and tone. So again, you'll ask yourself the question, how does the poet achieve this effect? So very similar to how tone was identified in the poem in our last e-presentation, where we use questions to generate each stage or each process. This is very much the same route that we would use in integrating imagery into an essay. So with that said, our third ways in which to integrate imagery into essay is asking the question, perhaps, is there a predominance of a particular imagery? So is there a particular imagery that stands out more so than others? So perhaps maybe visual, you're able to see more, or maybe a tactile imagery, so there's the sense of touching is more prevalent. Or another question you can ask yourself, is there a blending of images? So images are not just confined to one particular sense. However, it can be inclusive of many senses. So you might have visual, auditory, hearing, etc., all coming together as one. Then, is there an unusual use of imagery? So again, is there an unusual way in which the poet is using or presenting the images that's happening within the poem? An unusual way would be a very odd or strange, bizarre, something that you're not generally accustomed to see auditory or visual being presented as. And then the last one would be, question you might want to ask is, what is the overall effect? So what effect does the use of these various images convey throughout the poem? And in your next slide, we're going to be looking at donative and connotative language. Donative or donotation language refers to the literal meaning of a word. So in essence, the dictionary definition. So for example, if you look up the word snake in a dictionary, you'll discover that one of its denotative meanings is, and I quote, any of numerous scaly, legless, sometimes venomous reptiles having a long, tapering, cylindric body and found in most tropical and temperate regions, end of quote. So that was an exact definition that was taken from the dictionary to define snake. On the other hand, connotation or connotative language refers to the associations that are connected to a certain word or the emotional suggestions related to the word, or to that word rather. So the connotative meanings of a word exist together with the denotative meanings. So for example, the connotation for the word snake within a Western context could include evil or danger, because in African context, snakes would have a much different meaning, not one of evil or being dangerous, but rather it would represent good luck and also fertility. Bear in mind also that poets often deviate from the denotative meanings of words to create a much vibrant and fresher ideas and images. Such deviations from the literal meanings are called figures of speech or figurative language. And throughout our course so far, we have gone through a number of figure of speech. And sometimes they're also referred to as literary devices, which takes us into our last slide, which is looking at allusion and symbol. And the first definition that's given for allusion is a reference to a well-known work of art, music, history. And if you notice in bracket, I have event or people, because when we refer to history, we can be talking about a historical event or a historical figure. As well, allusion can be a reference to literature. So often, especially in Renaissance, if you recall, if you've done Renaissance or in Victorian literature, they often made reference to very popular literature. Most commonly was the Bible, so biblical allusion. And if you recall, in the sheet with topic 5, there was a reference to the garden. And that garden was not just about a garden having flowers or your typical garden, but it was a biblical allusion referring to the Garden of Eden. So that would be an example of literature, the Bible being a literary text, or if you recall some of Shakespeare's play, where there's oftentimes not necessarily biblical reference, but there may be reference to other writers' work. And then our last figure of speech is symbol, and here the definition says symbol is a literary device that contains several layers of meaning, often concealed at first sight, and is representative of several other aspects, concepts, traits than those that are visible in literal translation alone. And before I wrap up, just something to keep in mind for symbols is remembering that symbols carry different cultural meaning. So, for example, the color black is a symbol, and it might, in Western context, it's seen as evil and bad. However, in some other cultural context, for example, Chinese culture, it's seen as good luck. So that would be something to keep in mind when we look at symbol, how they also have different cultural representation depending on what the poet is, the symbol the poet is trying to represent. And that is it for our topic 5, e-presentation.